together. So if you've got two moist membranes, show this in anatomy. These are the walls of the alveolus, right? And you breathe air in, and the air is moist and warm because it's a mucous membrane. Then what happens is, you make this moist, you breathe air in, that's great, opens the air sac, and you breathe air out, it sticks. So what surfactant does is it puts an oily layer over the inside of the air sac so that when you do breathe out, when the air sacs touch each other, they don't stick, they slide against each other, right? And that's what we developed this in fetal development, about 7th month of gestation, 8th month of gestation. It's late in gestation. So when babies are about to be born, a month before they're born, the surfactant cells start secreting surfactant because it's getting ready for that baby to start breathing air. All right, there's no air going into the baby's lungs. So when the baby breathes, air comes in, as long as we've got that nice moist, or not moist, but that oily layer, then when they breathe out, then the air sacs don't stick. If you don't have that oily layer, if you're born too soon and your surfactant cells aren't working right, then baby's little air sacs collapse and they have a really hard time opening them up again. They really have to breathe heavy.
So with premature babies, what do we do to keep that from happening?
They give mom steroids and hope that they can delay birth for a while to get those steroids. The steroids will activate those. They may put the baby on kind of like a little sort of a CPAP deal where the air gets kind of forced in. They may use synthetic type surfactant with the baby's lungs. Do the best they can. Your lungs sit in your thoracic cavity above your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is important for breathing. It sits like this when you breathe in, the diaphragm pulls down, pulls on the bottom parts of the lung. You've got intercostal muscles between your ribs that contract and pull the rib cage up. So we expand the thoracic cavity, which pulls on the lung. Remember that your lung has a membrane around it. It's a double membrane. The outer layer is connected to the thoracic cavity, the rib cage, the diaphragm, etc. The inner layer is fused to the lung. The inner layer is connected to the lung. And in between is fluid. So when you breathe, when the diaphragm pulls and the ribs pull, they pull that outer layer out. When that outer layer gets pulled out, that fluid, it creates like a suction. The presence of the fluid pulls on the inner layer, which then pulls on the lung, which means your lung expands. And that's what brings air into the lung. It's a pressure difference, it's a pressure gradient. We'll talk a little bit more about it. When you breathe out, the diaphragm domes back up. The rib cage compresses, puts pressure on the outer layer, puts pressure on the fluid, which puts pressure on the inner layer, and the lung space gets smaller, and you breathe out. So it's a changing of the lung expansion and contraction for air to flow in and out. Remember that the pulmonary blood flow is the blood flow to the lungs. Comes from which ventricle? Right ventricle. And we know that the right ventricle needs to equal the left ventricle for stroke volume, right? The amount of blood it needs. All So, I guess here we are. Ventilation, how does air flow in? It has to do with the expansion of the lung because of the contraction of those muscles and the movement of that membrane and the pulling of the fluid and the pulling on the lung. And then when you breathe out, it's a compression of all that. But in reality, it's a change in pressure. It's air pressures, a change in air pressures that allow air to flow in and out. It's a pressure gradient, just like a concentration gradient. If you got high pressure, it wants to go to the low pressure. If you're going to squeeze it, it's going to go the other direction. So let's look at some numbers here. If we look and say that atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury, when you're breathing in, after you breathe out, you should have an equilibrium here, 760 to 760. Okay, after an exhalation. Now I'm going to breathe in. My diaphragm's going to pull this way. We're going to pull on the lower part of the lung. My rib cage and my rib muscles are going to pull on the outer layer of the membrane, which is going to pull on the fluid, which is going to pull on the lung itself. And now my space is going to get bigger. The lung space, the space inside the lung is going to get bigger. What's that going to do to my pressure? It's going to drop it, right? It's going to decrease it. So let's say it goes down to 755. If this is still at 760 and this is 755, which way is air going to flow? Which way is the pressure going to go? Air flows in because of high pressure to low pressure. Okay? Then we'll get to an equilibrium again. We're going to bring air in until we get to an equilibrium, right? Now we're going to breathe out. Now my rib cage is going to push on the outer layer, which is going to push on the fluid, which is going to push on the inner layer. My diaphragm is going to push on the bottom part of the lung, and what's that going to do to my space? Decrease it, which is going to do what to my pressure? Push it up. So now let's say it goes to 765. Which way is air going to flow? Out. It's all about pressure gradient. You expand the space, air comes in. You squeeze the space, increases the pressure, pushing the air out.
So aren't hiccups like your diaphragm?
It's a spasm in the diaphragm.
What causes that though?
Just a muscle spasm anywhere in any muscle.
So when people say to hold your breath to get rid of hiccups, you're just trying to keep them down.
You're like trying to reset the odd contraction, odd whatever's going on. Kind of. A couple of terms here. Compliance. Compliance means the ability of the lung to stretch. Compliance is the ability of the lung to stretch. Elasticity is the ability of the lung to, what do we say is important about elasticity in anatomy? Recoil. Stretch, but it recoils, right? So when you breathe in, your lungs stretch. That's good. We want it to stretch. But we also want it to recoil too. Okay? Respiratory distress syndrome, which is that problem with the little air sacs in babies. That's a compliance problem. The air sacs are stuck together. They're not stretching open again. That's a compliance issue. An elasticity issue would be where we've stretched it open, but we can't get it back out. Emphysema is an elasticity problem. Emphysema is a disease in which your air sacs, your alveoli, which are supposed to look like little grape clusters, the walls between them get degraded and it basically becomes a big air sac. So you lose surface area, right? Because these are supposed to be surrounded by capillaries. So we've got all these capillaries surrounding all these individual little air sacs. And if it's one big air sac, you don't have as much capillary, right? You lose surface area for gas exchange. And then if we can't recoil, what can't you do? Oh, you're all stretched out.
You can't.
You're good and stretchy.
You can't shrink that.
You can't get the carbon dioxide out.
Correct. We can't get the CO2 out, and we can't
Bring them to.
get as much oxygen in. Oxygen. Can't get as much oxygen in, so we're gonna decrease our gas exchange here. And if you have emphysema, you're on oxygen, because we want as much oxygen in as we can get. People with emphysema have what's called barrel chest. They gotta, that's all they can do, and then they can't get it out, right? So not only that, if you can't get the CO2 out, then that stays in your bloodstream, and we're gonna learn later that that alters your pH. That's gonna make you acidic. And oh, you nursing folks, this is a big deal. So you're gonna wanna listen carefully in this section, because you're gonna get it right away. We talked about surfactant and surface tension. Bronchoconstriction is the constriction of our smooth muscles. As we said, with asthma, they're constricting because of allergens, or sometimes it's exercise induced. And a bronchodilator is just a smooth muscle relaxer. Do I have time? Okay, time. Oh, let's skip a little bit, because I wanted to bring something down from lab and I forgot it. So let's skip over to something that we can do right here. Let's look at this. This is on page 60 in your notes, the last page of your notes. And we can plug this in anywhere. So, perfusion means blood flow. How well is the blood flowing to a space, to an area? That's perfusion. You have good perfusion, you got good oxygenation to your organs and such. Ventilation in the lung, ventilation must match perfusion. If we think about in the foot, let's say your foot has got, let's say something is constricting your foot. It's being had like a, I don't know, crushing injury or something, and we don't have enough oxygen to our toes. Those cells that are not receiving enough oxygen are going to start screaming. They're going to be like, this hurts, this is painful, I need oxygen, I'm going to die. So what the body does is, what's it going to do? Is it going to vasodilate or vasoconstrict? Are the blood vessels going to vasodilate or vasoconstrict to this area of low oxygen? They're going to dilate, right? So your vessels are going to say, oh my God, there's not enough blood flow there. I need to widen and send more blood because these cells are going to die, right? They're going to vasodilate. They're going to open up. The exact opposite is true in the lung. The complete opposite is true in the lung. In the lung, if you've got a section of the lung, air sacs, that are not able to exchange gas, they're full of fluid, you got pneumonia, you're not exchanging gases, then at the level of the lung, instead of sending more blood there, instead of vasodilating to an area that ain't working, we're going to shut that down and we're going to redirect it to another area that is. So we're going to close that off, but we're going to vasodilate, we're going to vasoconstrict to the area that is not working, and we're going to vasodilate to an area that is. It's totally opposite than the rest of the body. You got a section in the body that is not receiving oxygen, you're going to vasodilate, trying to send oxygen there. Why does it do it this way? Because what do we have to do? you have to continue to exchange oxygen. So if this alveolus or this section of alveoli or this lobe of the lungs is damaged, is full of fluid, why send blood flow there if you can't exchange the gases?
Energy efficient.
Shut it down, redirect it to a place that's working so that we can continue to maximize our gas exchange. Don't waste your time in a place that is not working.
Would that end up dying?
Sometimes. Sometimes that can become fibrotic and COPD, ultimate damage to the lung, and then if it's completely non-functional, I'm guessing the blood supply is just basically
If
nil.
you get the fluid out, will it start going back?
Yes, as long as, yeah, if you improve from your pneumonia and everything goes, and is, fluid's gone, yeah, that'll, yeah. All right, that's it. Have a good Easter break.
Can you